Over the past several years, we have had a number of requests from people in this room and other people in the community to do some Indigenous history at this hall. And we have made some attempts in the past to find qualified speakers. We weren't successful until tonight. And we are very honored to have two presenters from the University of Maine's Anthropology Department, Dr. Bonnie Newsom and Dr. Alice Kelley. Dr. Newsom is an Indigenous archaeologist interested in the pre-contact lifeways of Maine's native peoples. She is a member of the Penobscot Nation. Dr. Kelley's research interests are focused on geoarchaeology, specifically how humans deal with and are influenced by landscapes and environmental factors. And without further ado, I will turn this over to them. Thank you.
I'm a wanderer, so bear with me. Let me take this off so you can hear me clearly. I just want to also introduce Deirdre McGrath, who is an undergraduate student with us at the University of Maine. She's working in the Northeast Archaeology Lab with me, and she's here tonight. She passed out some brochures. I apologize, we didn't have enough, but you know, that's what keeps us young. These up-and-coming students interested in history and heritage and archaeology and all of those things. So, thanks, Deirdre. So I want to thank you all for having us this evening. And tonight we'll be talking about Native American shell heaps, or coastal archaeology sites that are, am I too far away? I'm giving a signal that you can't hear me. Is this better? Oh, I've got to be really close and tied to the microphone tonight, so that's going to be a challenge. Okay. Thank you. Dr. Kelley and I are going to tag team our presentation tonight, which the title is Once They're Gone for Good, a conversation about Native American shell heaps, climate change, and confronting heritage loss. So what I wanted to start off with is a little bit of Indigenous history. Native peoples have lived here in Maine for roughly 12,000 years, and much of the record of that history is encapsulated in subsurface archaeological spaces, oral narratives, and intergenerational memory, as well as our petroglyph sites, or a number of petroglyph sites in Maine that represent Indigenous history and art. The image on the left is an artist's rendition of Gluskab. And Gluskab is actually an Indigenous culture hero here in the Northeast, and he is responsible for the creation of people. He actually shot, as the story goes, he shot an arrow into the ash tree, and out of the ash tree came the people. And so as Indigenous people, we are very closely connected to the ash tree. Many of our baskets, most of our baskets are constructed of this tree, and it brings us our livelihoods. Many of our livelihoods are tied up in the ash tree. So Gluskab has also done a lot of landscaping in Maine as well. He's created many of the features in Penobscot Bay. Mount Kineo in Moosehead Lake is the creation of Gluskab, so he's had quite an impact on Maine. And as such, these oral narratives are a source of information for understanding Indigenous people's worldview and lifeways. In the center is a photograph of Passamaquoddy petroglyphs, and Passamaquoddies are one of 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine. They're in the Down East region. These petroglyphs are in Machias Bay, and petroglyph, for those of you who do not know, are images that are packed into stone, and they actually also occur all over the state of Maine as well. The important piece of this is oftentimes you hear that there's no written record for Native peoples prior to European contact, but this is obviously a written record that tells a story and tells a history. In fact, in Machias Bay, there's a petroglyph of a ship on one of the outcrops there, and so that's obviously tells something about people's interactions with large sailing ships that came to North America. And then finally, the lower image on your right is a picture of archaeological excavations at a site in Eddington, Maine, and these, like the other two areas, also encapsulate information on Native American history and heritage, and really this is kind of the area where we're going to focus tonight. Specifically, we're going to talk about shell heaps or shell mounds. Sometimes they're called shell middens. These are important repositories of Indigenous history, and they're actually fragile, very fragile cultural spaces, but they contain a record of Indigenous lifeways spanning probably around 5,000 years in Maine, although most of the shell heaps that we have here in Maine date to roughly 3,000 years old or less. These are human-generated accumulations of shell, and where people in the past would harvest shellfish and they would deposit them in places along the coast. The image on the left is from 19th century excavations at a site in the Damerscota area, and the image on the right is also from the Damerscota area, and you can see the difference. Some of them are fairly well exposed, others of them are not. And shell heaps are not unique to Maine. They occur all over the world. In some places they were constructed as shells or monuments, shell rings or monuments. Here in the southeast you can see that these are some examples of those features on the landscape. Around 6,000 years ago, people started creating large shell mounds in riverine settings. And then a few thousand years later, they started forming these rings of shell on the landscape. And they're found in Florida and Georgia and South Carolina. And archaeologists debate about there's archaeological debates about a lot of things, but they debate, are these intentional constructions around some barrier around a living space, or are they monuments? So there's a lot of uncertainty about what these shell heaps actually served as. The image on the left is a 3D representation of a place called Fig Island. And these are shell rings in South Carolina. These sites are on the National Register of Historic Places, and excavations here have not produced a lot of evidence of people actually living on the rings themselves. And again, there's been some interpretations that suggest they were deliberately created. And part of that is because they know that people were depositing these shells quite rapidly. The image on the right shows some of the various shapes of these shell rings in the southeast, and you can see that it outlines them in the various states, Georgia and Florida and South Carolina. So here in Maine, we don't have a good understanding right now of how these shell heaps are present on the landscape, or if there's any kind of patterning that occurs in terms of the shell mounds. What we do know is that most shell heaps are deposits of either soft shell clams and oysters. Oyster shell heaps tend to occur primarily in the Damerscota River region, and these are relatively very large, and so the shell heaps vary in size. They may have thin layers. You can see at the photo on the left there's, do I have a pointer on this? Maybe it's not. But you can see on the photo on the left there's a light band of shell, maybe a very thin layer of shell that was deposited at one point, or it may be a very thick layer of shell with multiple layers. Sometimes they're whole shells, sometimes they're crushed shells, and lots of times people have dug holes into them. Sometimes you find mortuary features within them. So they're pretty complex spaces when you're trying to kind of reconstruct past human occupation at these locations. So there are over 2,000 shell heaps on the coast of Maine, and again, they range from very large ones like you can see in the Clinton and Damascata, to some very small ones like in Washington County. Those tend to be fairly small, and it's unclear whether or not they were the remnants of ones that were much larger, or perhaps only a few families lived there at a certain time. So they do range quite drastically from place to place. And, you know, one of the problems with them, however, is that most of them are rapidly eroding. You can see they're in exposed areas along the coastline. That makes them vulnerable to not only human impacts, but also environmental impacts as well. And Dr. Kelley is going to elaborate a little bit on that in a bit. So one of the most notable characteristics of these places that Native peoples constructed is their preservation of varied data sets. And because the shells act as a preservation agent, they actually reduce the acidity in the soil. And so these sites contain artifacts of what we call ecofacts, or those natural materials that are often brought to a site but not modified by humans. Those kinds of things are very well preserved. And on Maine's interior, these kinds of materials generally disintegrate, or they don't last over time. And so we can get plant remains, for example, nuts, seeds, oftentimes from fire hearts or other kinds of features that are in shell heaps. And we also, of course, get lots of shell. We can see how the sizes of shell have changed through time over thousands of years. And that's pretty, some of those shells are pretty big, I have to say. And it's pretty impressive to see, you know, how large those shells were able to get, those plants were able to get. And then we also have faunal or bone material, and that is well preserved. Again, on the interior of Maine, these kinds of materials are not preserved well. And what this can tell us, it can help us understand what families were taking in terms of food resources. It can tell us about past ideologies in terms of the human-animal relationship. For example, sometimes we'll get certain animal parts that appear to be in ceremonial contexts, and so we can begin to get some insight into how people view themselves in relation to other non-human species. We also, these sites also produce lots of material culture, and this varies from stone tools, pottery, and bone tools. You'll see here, these are on your left are some projectile points recovered from shell heaps. In the center, we know that people in Maine started making pottery about 3,000 years ago, and they abandoned that practice probably at European contact, or maybe a little before. We also see down in the lower right, you can see a bird bone flute, so that gives us some insight into music. And I like to tell people that, if you think about people living on the coast of Maine, and you think of you often think about, okay, they're getting clams, but they're playing music, their kids are riding the waves, you know, there are all these other things that families do, and that tends to humanize them a little bit. The bird bone flute was found in Acadia. There are some shell beads as well. So again, we have a sense of personal ornamentation and you know, a look into kind of what was valuable and important to people. We also get cultural features. And cultural features is anything that's in an archaeological site that you can't kind of pick up and take back to the lab without destroying it. So things like a house floor or a fire hearth. Those kinds of things are considered features, and you'll see here that these are actually really helpful to us as archaeologists because we can begin to get a lay of the land if we start mapping some of these things. So one of the unique features that was encountered several years ago in a Machias field school was this standing stone. And you can see, we know that people put that there because the surrounding matrix is not the same, right? So people had to have put that there and stood it on end for some reason. And the photo is not super clear, but you can actually see in the stratigraphy where people dug down to put this stone in there. And so we don't, again, you know, oftentimes with archaeology and trying to interpret why people did what they did, you know, really the people who did it are the only ones that know. But we try and think about, you know, why might people have done this, and what does this standing stone mean? Is it a marker of sorts, maybe a boundary, maybe some sort of ceremonial feature? In the image on the right, you can see that you have a couple of different, that's an archaeological unit again. There are a couple different soil colors or differences in the soil. In the upper left corner is this dark staining. And that could have been remnants of a fire hearth. It could have been some sort of organic activity that went on that made the soil darker. And the beauty of science today is we can actually take samples of that and begin to dissect it a bit in order to understand what that staining is from. And so there's things called environmental DNA. We can take a look to see if there's any DNA samples in there. We can take a look at and see whether or not there's plant remains or any kind of animal remains within that space. So we, as archaeologists, we love features because it really starts to get us to what the people were doing on a day-to-day basis. And we get things like house floors, and you can actually see little circles where people put their posts for wigwams. So it's, for me, these are probably more important than some of the artifacts that we recover. So in addition to all of these wonderful things that Native people have left us, gifted us to learn from, we also have 4,000 years roughly of a paleo-environmental record. And these things like bone and plant remains can tell us things about extinct species. So here on the coast of Maine, we know that there was sea mink, and we find sea mink in the archaeological record where people have actually taken sea mink, great auk. Both of these species were hunted to extinction, and so we just don't have them anymore. But we can learn from them from these cultural spaces. In your lower left is an image of a swordfish rostrum. And we know that around 5,000 years ago that Maine's waters were conducive to having swordfish in our waters. And so we see that people are actually taking swordfish in Maine. And so this image is of a swordfish rostrum. But the neat thing about this image here is that there's also a deer bone there, and one of the projects we're working on right now at the University of Maine is to radiocarbon date some of these swordfish that have been recovered in order to understand just, when that water temperature shift, or when that warm water temperature existed. We have some dates on this already, but we have better techniques in our radiocarbon dating now, so we're moving to try and refine that time period a little more clearly. So all of this is linked to Indigenous lifeways, and I'm thrilled that the community here has an interest in learning more about Indigenous peoples in Maine. We, as Indigenous peoples of Maine, refer to ourselves collectively as the Wabanaki. It's from Wabubnahik, or people of the dawn, or people of first light, because we are the ones to see the sunrise first, and what's referred to as Turtle Island here. There are 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine, the Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, and they have contemporary communities in those locations. You can see on the maps. We are working as Indigenous peoples, we're working very hard to maintain some of our lifeways that we inherited from our ancestors, and so things like birch bark canoes, the basketry, intergenerational teaching and learning, and we're working very hard to integrate often contemporary science into some of our lifeways in order to kind of blend the 2 worlds together. But these shell heaps or shell mounds are a part of our heritage, and they're non-renewable resources. Once they're gone for good. And for Indigenous peoples, that's been a common story. We've lost a lot of our connections to our past through no fault of our own. And so, as an Indigenous person, I see these shell heaps as a way to kind of reconnect with our ancestors and learn from them, not just learn about them, but learn from them. So in addition to the Indigenous materials and features and those kinds of things in these shell mounds, we often also see, occasionally, not as common as Indigenous material remains, but we often see European materials as well. And so the 2 pots on either end are from Machias Bay, and one is a French pot, St. Ange pot, dates to around the 1600s, and the one on the far right is a salt glazed chamber pot, which dates to around the 1700s. And so these are, the thing about finding these in a shell heap is, you don't know who used them. Was it a European that used them at the site, or was it an Indigenous person that used them at the site? So this contact period is really fascinating in terms of thinking about relationships cross-culturally, but also how Indigenous peoples were using materials. The little figurine in the center is from Malaga Island. Malaga Island is a post-contact site where marginalized communities, African American, Native American, and I think Irish folks were there as well, where they lived and they harvested clams for the cod fishery. And so we see that there are shell heaps on there as well. And for anybody who's interested in Malaga Island, the Maine State Museum has a wonderful online curriculum for that. And so I encourage you, it's a fascinating story. So I wanted to talk a bit about about this area. There are shell heaps in the Surry area have been recorded by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and these seem to all be Native American sites, likely dating somewhere to the last 3,000 years. Some of them represent maybe 1 or 2 artifact finds, others are larger. One of the sites that is really fascinating to me is one that has quahog primarily, and we don't see that very often in this on the coast of Maine. We do get quahog shell heaps on occasion, but quahog is what Indigenous peoples made wampum from, and those wampum belts were used to trade in as treaty tools oftentimes, and so they would create these little purple and white beads and make these long, beautiful belts. And so that site in particular is fascinating from my perspective. This site was actually last visited in 1980, and at that time, the archaeologists who visited the site noted that noted the erosion and said it would likely be destroyed in the next few decades. So, in line with that, this is kind of a list of the sites that are in the Surry area, and you can see they haven't been visited much. Early archaeologists didn't really document erosion, but later in the 1970s and 80s, you can see that folks did visit these sites and did document erosion. And one site was visited in 87. That one had been disturbed by the construction of a foundation. Another one was visited by the same individual in 87 and documented that moderate to extreme erosion was happening, and said, you know, it's just so far gone that it doesn't warrant further investigation. So it's really a loss, and this is kind of evidence of that heritage loss that we are experiencing at these locations. So, and the other piece of things is that very often Indigenous heritage sites are marginalized in terms of preservation efforts. We hear a lot about kind of some of the built environment, and while I know that historic preservation funding isn't that great across the board, usually the funding tends to go to places that the built heritage of this country, and not so much to the Indigenous heritage. And so I think, you know, and part of that is because people just don't know. People just don't know what's being lost. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Kelley, and she is going to talk more about what the problem is and how we're hoping to fix it, or at least address it.
And speak here tonight. As we said, there is a problem going on here with the shell pins here in Maine as well as in other places. And the primary problem is that they're disappearing. And I think that's a message that we're hoping to convey. And as we said in the beginning, once they're gone, they're gone. We can't put them back together again. And so what are the sorts of things that are really affecting these middens or shell heaps? One is wave erosion. You know that we've been having some pretty incredible storms with big waves, and that obviously affects the coast. It affects the entire coast. You hear about this, but every time you hear about